welcome to our panel. I'm really glad to see many of you here. Not just my students, which actually makes me happy that some other people actually have found this panel interesting. I would like to thank the Center for the Study of Europe for helping me out and organizing this event, which I find timely and important, at least for us from the Balkans. I would like also personally to thank Kaya and Elizabeth for being supporting and being with me and making this possible. And I'm Mr. glad to great and to have with us two extraordinary scholars and experts when it comes to the Balkans, and I'm looking forward to your presentations, insightful, thought-provoking, I would say, and engaging as you can be. But allow me before to make a couple of points about the topic and maybe something that I can offer from my side just to warm up the atmosphere. First of all, the question is, do the EU and the Western Balkans share the same future? And I have the answer, and I will give you right away. No. So, not at least for my generation and for generation to come. Then in 30, 40 years or 50 years, then it may be. But from our perspective, whether does it matter or whether it matters or not, it's up to us to answer. So, I know that my intervention is going to set a tune, and that tune can be like a bit negative when it comes to European Union and what European Union has been doing in the Balkans. Actually, to strike balance and just to show, to appear not to be Eurosceptic from the Balkans perspective, I decided purposely to wear this tie. This is an EU tie, given to me it's a Luxembourg presidency. Back in time, in my first incarnation, when I was diplomat, working as a diplomat of a country which was candidate country for the European Union. Only candidate countries and European Union members were entitled to get ties like this. This is just to show you how much European Union cares about us. And that those who say that they don't care actually are not saying the truth. So this is the evidence that European Union cares about us, and this is the evidence, in fact, that I care about European Union very much. Whatever you hear about European Union later on, just take it with a grain of salt. And indeed, European Union has something to offer to the Balkans, and its powerful currency was membership. And that membership was promised back in time. We cannot remember 2003 in Thessaloniki. European country, European Union country, and Balkans country, Greece. So, and indeed, in the years following the Thessaloniki summit, we witnessed some progress on both sides, which means both sides have been engaged in the process. European Union backing up the process, and Western Balkans countries, embarking upon very demanding process of democratization. But somehow, in the middle of the road, we stuck nowhere. So therefore, I would say that, this is just like a myth that every democratic transition is leading towards a happy ending. In most cases, if it was backed up by, in this case, European Union, it may have like a, let's say, I cannot say tragic, but definitely a disappointing end. If I look at the situation right now, I would say that relationship between Balkans and Western Balkans and European Union resembles a slow fade relationship. It's a dying partnership, where both partners speak about common future, but in fact looking actively for an alternative. So Balkan states are looking for an alternative, and alternative appears, and it is embodied in Russia and China. While European Union, in fact, speaks about Balkans once they fulfill criteria, which actually over time have become a moving target. Once they fulfill criteria, they will be able to join European Union. So, from my perspective, both sides committed to doing something back in time in 2003, which means if you sign an agreement and you promise something, then you have to deliver. Both sides have to deliver. But it's politically correct to blame Western Balkans countries for underperformance in democratization of their countries. Indeed, they underperformed. And indeed, they didn't deliver. But indeed, European Union didn't deliver too. Therefore, why to blame just one for something which is obviously failure of both? So, just a couple more points. There are some positive signs on horizon lately. First of all, Bosnia and Herzegovina got candidate status, waiting for so long. Then North Macedonia and Albania, they opened accession negotiation talks in 2022. Then Kosovo finally, Kosovo citizens, were entitled or are entitled as of like a couple of days ago to travel without visa to European Union. Everything is positive, but there is something, how to say, troublesome in it. European Commission, which is entitled to provide evaluation of progress done by candidate countries, European Commission, which means body created by European Union member states, to do so, recommended opening accession talks, visa-free regime for Kosovo, and candidate status for Bosnia and Herzegovina a long time ago, which means European members, they ignored their own bodies, which puts a question over credibility of the process and credibility of European Union itself when it comes to Western Balkans. So therefore, they didn't trust their own institutions, which were put in place to evaluate progress by members, by aspirant countries. Many therefore think about this as, extorted concessions. And those concessions are extorted, imagine, by whom? By Russia and the war in Ukraine. Therefore, we can speak that Russia, in fact, though it may sound counterintuitive, helped us get what we wanted after so many years. I will stop here, and I will turn to my guests to continue, not along this line. They may disagree with me, they may definitely provide better insight, more thoughtful remarks on the process. I'm glad to introduce Jelena Subotić, who is this night with us here. She's professor in the Department of Political Science at Georgia State University. And her most recent book, I've earned so many praises and prizes, so that I can just list some of them. I cannot list all of them. The book is titled Yellow Star, Red Star, Holocaust Remembrance After Communism, and has won 2022 Joseph Rothschild Prize in Nationalism and Ethnic Studies. Then American Political Science Association, European Politics and Society Book Prize, And then 2020, Robert L. Jervis and Paul W. Schroeder Prize for the best book in international history and politics, and so on and so forth. So that definitely we are honored to have you this evening with us. And I'm looking forward to your comments about 20 years after the Thessaloniki summit, where we are at this moment. Jelena, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, undeserved. I'm very happy to be here and happy to speak in front of a full room. So it's a little bit of a Groundhog Day, because I remember, I'm old enough that I've been coming to these events over the last 20 years to similar, answering similar questions. What is the future of the Western Balkans, and the atmosphere in these rooms and the predictions have kind of declined with each year, I think. So that where there was some enthusiasm and some reasonably optimistic expectations, maybe 20 years ago, that the region of the Western Balkans will be integrated into the EU. I don't know many people who believe that now. So there are some, and I'll discuss a little bit where the difference may be between the academic community and the policymakers who are pushing back and keep telling me, yes, we're very committed. to let you in, but without much to show for. So what has happened? What's gone so terribly wrong? I want to start by saying that I think you kind of intuited part of it in your opening remarks, is that the European Union made what is called kind of normative rhetorical commitment back 20 plus years ago, that most of former Eastern Europe would join the European Union, and specifically the countries of the Western Balkans. What's happened with the normative and rhetorical commitment is that it's become a rhetorical entrapment, which means they keep having to say the same thing over and over again because they've committed to saying the same thing over and over again. So now you can't, you know how like you make a promise to your partner that you will end up going to this restaurant and you really don't want to, but now saying no is gonna cause so many more problems. So you know that you're not gonna go to a restaurant, and your partner also knows, everybody knows. But there's kind of a quiet stalemate to avoid an open conflict. So I think that's where we are. For the purposes of the EU, it's very beneficial to have the prospect of accession still alive, because it proves its own value and its own identity to the European Union as a liberal, democratic, progressive in their own view project that's supposed to bring peace to Europe and integrate Europe into this kind of utopian transatlantic peaceful partnership. So for the purposes of the EU, it's important to keep this fantasy going. For the purposes of local countries, it's important also to keep the fantasy going because it's useful for their electoral chances. You don't want to be the politician running on a platform, let's elect me, I will definitely not take you into the EU. So that's not a good campaign slogan. So everybody runs on, yes, I'm going to be the one to let you finally get into the EU. And I think all actors at some level know that this is a fantasy. So why is it a fantasy? What has happened to derail any possibility, I mean, there's still a possibility, but any kind of reasonable, at least short-term prospect of EU accession? I think a couple of things. Some of it have to do, I think more actually have to do with the EU itself than the Western Balkans countries themselves. I think part of it has to do with the EU structurally not being able to accommodate accession. And I think having some serious buyer's remorse regarding accession of previous candidate states who have ended up being maybe more trouble than they're worth. So Greece, with its debt implosion, was a lot of trouble, and with just ask Germany how they feel about letting Greece in and having to bail them out. Romania, Bulgaria got in with the level of democratic and economic reforms that were 10% of what is asked of contemporary candidates, but somehow they kind of snuck in. So there's some buyer's remorse on that front, and I think there's significant issue with what to do with countries like Hungary and Poland that have gone into the EU and have turned kind of proto-fascist. And the problem that the EU has on its hands is that the EU doesn't have a door out. You can't, it's just like this club. I think about how strange it is to have a club that you can only join and you can never be kicked out. It's great, right? I mean, but not for the owners of the establishment. And I think the problem that the EU found out is that they never really developed a mechanism for sustained membership or for ending membership in case things go wrong, because the EU developed as an idea. It's an idea. It's a great idea, but it's an idea. It's not really a functioning institution that can accommodate real change in political behavior of its members. And I think that comes out of, as I said, it being more of an idea, but a particular kind of idea that was very obviously optimistic, but also incredibly naive. And in some ways, I would say arrogant, in thinking that everybody will want to join the EU. Why wouldn't you? EU is great. And you will somehow, by osmosis, after you join the EU, that would temper all of your bad habits or your bad choices, and you will just become this kind of, successful, economically vibrant, politically stable entity that would learn the tricks of being a good liberal democracy from your European neighbors. And again, I mean, when you say it out loud, it sounds really naive. And when you read the founding documents, it was naive. So I think that's the crux of our problem here is that the EU itself doesn't really have kind of a structural way to deal with problems that arise and serious problems for reason. So then that has led to serious disinterest in EU enlargement among current European countries. And we know that because some of the countries have tried to put up some of the enlargement votes up for referendum. So you remember that happened in the Netherlands and that this happened in France, and then they stopped because they realized that with Brexit, once you ask people what they think of the EU and you don't like what they say, that can lead to like a lot of problems. But that has shown, I think, a significant democratic deficit and the lack of legitimacy within EU populations themselves of current EU members and lack of interest in letting these others in. And then I think the thing that really made me just completely get off the EU accession bandwagon was what happened with North Macedonia. That was, I was kind of done. So just to refresh everybody's memory, North Macedonia was also on the path towards EU, and it's called North Macedonia because Greece blackmailed them and bullied them into changing their name for all sorts of Greek nationalistic reasons that we can get into because it's very irritating and very primitive in its nationalism. And so Macedonia had to change its name to North Macedonia. They did that. They did all the stuff they were supposed to do, changed their name. The government fell, new government came in, government fell, new government came in, did all that, changed the name. And then Emmanuel Macron, who was the presiding head, said, I'm not feeling it. Just not working out for me right now, this North Macedonia thing. Gave no reason, nothing. Just said, it's just not working out for me. And imagine what you have. You're like a small country, you're marginalized, you're poor, you have internal strife, you're bullied by all these neighbors. The Bulgarians tell you don't exist, your language doesn't exist. The Greeks are telling you that you're a joke. The Serbs are coming in, messing in with your churches. And then, France says, well, everything that you've done is just not going to work. Partly we could, I don't want to be in Emmanuel Macron's brain. I don't think anybody really does, for that matter. But I think we can try to look at from Macron's perspective. I think for his own electoral chances, he's facing a very hostile electorate. He doesn't want to piss people off any more than he already has. The French population is not interested in bailing out other poor countries. But also I think there's a thin or not so thin kind of Islamophobic veil happening here. North Macedonia is about 20 to 30% Muslim. They have a Albanian minority. And I think that Macron was putting that in the context of larger French Islamophobia and lack of interest in getting any more Muslims into Europe, and just kind of vetoed North Macedonia. And imagine what that does to other countries in the region that are trying to get on a path to the EU. So why would they do what is asked for them if they can be vetoed at any moment in time? Why would they go through the difficult economic reform and banking reform and financial reform and public sector reform and employment and all of that kind of stuff when there's just no sincerity or real commitment on behalf of EU partners who, for their own domestic political reasons, can choose to do whatever they choose to do. So that is from the EU side. And I'll say a few things from the side of the Western Balkans countries themselves. Obviously, these are not countries that are in great shape. They have a lot of political problems, a lot of economic problems. Some, like Serbia, have taken a hard turn towards authoritarianism. Again, but why wouldn't you? You're looking at Orban, you're looking at the Peace and Justice Party in Poland. They're gutting their constitutions. They're getting rid of their Supreme Court. So you're like, this is, and they're in the EU, so why would I be a better student? Just think about from the rational behavior of these leaders. And then also there's the at least in the case of Serbia, this, not only the turn towards authoritarianism and kind of crushing of any domestic opposition and media repression and all of that that's been going on. There's also this real hard embrace of Russia, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. Serbia's always loved Russia. It's always this like dysfunctional kind of big brother who ignores you and you're like, but I want to hang out with you situation. It's always happened. But it's kind of been less consequential than it is now. Now Serbia has made a choice, and that choice is, it's very difficult to go back. And they've made a very clear choice that they're going to be Russia's only European ally other than Belarus. And that's a choice. That's really like, you want to look around and be like, those are the guys I want to go, I'm going to go to the party with. And I don't see any path to walking that back, and that's just not something that the EU as a whole or individual EU members can forgive or negotiate with. Bosnia, and I'm sure Jasmin will talk more about Bosnia, has its own internal kind of cracks. Again, nothing new, and the pulls that Republika Srpska is pushing towards Serbia, and all constant threats of declaring of secession and cracking Bosnia into two. And we would kind of half joking, half not, but I wasn't kidding really before we started that maybe Montenegro's got the best chance. So if I were to bet, I'd put $10 out. I'm like, put a lot of money.
In this economy?
But I think I'm good for $10 for Montenegro maybe. But I think other than that, I think the situation is quite static and stagnant. So that's it. I'll end there.
Thank you, Jelena. I just want, before turning to Jasmin, to make a comment or two. You told me, if I may, before the panel started, that you could have done it with one word, just to come and say no chance, and then and that would be over. But you really elaborated eloquently why not. And to make one more point about North Macedonia and the EU approach, we have been, as a mantra by the EU, that we are judged by our deeds, not by our words, and that it's a merit-based approach. Then look at what facts tell us about Macedonia, North Macedonia or Macedonia, which means it was the first country which got candidate status, 2005. 17 years ago. So then they had to change their name and do all other things which are very difficult. And the European Commission in 2018 evaluated their progress and recommended the opening of accession talks with them. Then they waited for 4 years until France, Netherlands and Bulgaria let them start negotiating. If we judge by deeds, not by words, what one can conclude about European Union and their commitment to the region? Just make your conclusion. I will stop here and then now turn to Jasmin. Jasmin, you know, it's always glad to have you around, and then you know, you are just not a dear colleague, but an expert about the Balkans. Jasmin Mujanović is a political scientist and is specializing in politics of post-authoritarianism and post-conflict democratization. I would say challenging task, particularly for the Balkans. He has written 2 books. One deals with democratization in the Balkans, and it's titled Hunger and Fury, the Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans. And the other one, it is about to be, to be issued, which means it is available in December this year. At least for us from the Balkans, book that deals with a very sensitive issue. It's an issue of genocide and Bosniaks. The Bosniaks, nationhood after genocide. And I'm really looking forward to reading your book. You know very well how popular currently are history revisionism in the Balkans, and how all of a sudden people see what was happening in the 90s differently. including a recent event in Belgrade that the siege of Sarajevo didn't exist. And it was just like, I don't know how they described it. So he publishes, Jasmin publishes in, reports in different think tanks like Freedom House, European Council on Foreign Relations, Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, as well as in news, very well-known media like New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, etc. Jasmin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vesko. I have to say right off the bat, it's really a very terrific honor to be here. Thank you very much to the colleagues at BU for having me here. This is really, really very gratifying. I also have to say, if you will allow me, I think BU is very, very honored and privileged to have somebody of Vesko's caliber teaching a new generation of students on the Balkans. So that is, I think, a really, really terrific get for this school. And also, I will just echo everything that was said about Jelena's book a few minutes ago. It's, I would say, easily one of the most important books written about our region, probably in the last 10 or 15 years. It really is, it's a remarkable piece of scholarship. And not just because she's won far more awards than I will ever win in my life. So that having been said, I think Jelena has laid the foundations of sort of our analytical framework, and on the substance, I don't think there's really anything for me to disagree with, and I think we're very much in agreement in terms of everything that's gone wrong. What I would say, or what I would add, is two things. One, I would add a little bit more color to, I think, why this has all happened and why the EU project has essentially failed. And ultimately also who is on the worst end of the receiving end of the consequences of everything that has happened in the region. And I think Jelena has, I think, very passionately and eloquently and justifiably spoken at length about North Macedonia. And I want to bring Bosnia and Kosovo into the conversation a little bit, but I'll leave that for a moment. First of all, the thing about the EU, the thing about the EU is, of course, it is an ideological project. And as an ideological project, it is a fantastic ideological project, but because it is rooted not only in the experiences of World War I and World War II and the Holocaust, but also it has to be said, which is often forgotten about, the horrendous 19th century in Europe. Horrendous 19th century in Europe. So you have about a century and a half of horrific, near constant conflict in Europe. And out of that, you birthed this wondrous project of political, economic, and social unification. Now, the thing about that project of social and political unification is it's premised on the idea that everyone participating in the process wants to be there. Aha. And so that's where we run into the problem. When the EU gets to the task of post-Soviet enlargement in what was formerly the Eastern Bloc, it encounters a very receptive audience. But that very receptive audience, I think, is mistaken from the perspective of, shall we say, Brussels or the West, as to why they are doing that. Because as our friends in Ukraine will tell you today especially, one of the chief animating principles for why so many former Soviet republics and Eastern Bloc states wanted to get into the EU and, more importantly, into NATO was because of Russia. The EU was what it was, and it was great, and they built on it, and they've developed, and some countries have done very, very well in it, such as the Baltic states. Others, as Jelena has pointed out, Hungary and Poland, less so. But there it is. When it came time for the European Union to turn to the Western Balkans, it came into the region pregnant with all of those same expectations, that it would find in the region the same receptive audience. But when it turned to the Western Balkans in 2003 in Thessaloniki, it came to a region that had just concluded a decade of war. Not merely post-authoritarian democratization and mobilization, and after all, 1989 is the year that never happened in the Western Balkans, right? It encountered a region that had gone through, and in particular in the cases of Bosnia and Kosovo, that had gone through the worst atrocities and violence in Europe since the Second World War, up until, unfortunately, the present situation in Ukraine. Right? We had a decade of war between 1991 and 2001, of the 130 to 150,000 people killed during the Yugoslav Wars, in their entirety, fully 100,000 people are killed in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have the first instances of genocide in Europe since the Holocaust. This is not Romania, this is not Poland, this is not Estonia, as severe as those authoritarian regimes in those countries were during the duration of the Cold War. You need an entirely different set of tools to deal with these countries. And then there is an additional problem that both the EU and the US are categorically opposed to dealing with. And that is something that Jelena has also already alluded to, is the fact that in most of these countries, but above all in countries like Serbia, there is no lustration. There's no political transformation. Milosevic falls in October of 2000, and there's a brief interregnum where there's an experiment with quasi-democratic governance in Serbia. That very quickly peters out, in no small part due to the assassination of the first quasi-reformist prime minister that the country ever has, right, in 2003. But by the end of that decade, by 2012, Milosevic's old guard, Aleksandar Vučić, the current president of Serbia, and all the people around him who had all previously served in Milosevic's government, they're back in power. Serbia has less than a decade of experimentation in even the most generous sense of the term with democracy. And something that's also forgotten is that a very similar process, although arguably not as severe, also takes place in countries that actually do successfully join the EU. We've talked a lot about democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland, but people forget Slovenia and Croatia. Right? Slovenia has had essentially one major political figure for the better part of the last 3 decades, Janez Janša. Janez Janša spends 15 minutes in jail and then he's back to being prime minister. I exaggerate slightly. Croatia, which between about the late 2000s, the very late 2000s, between the period of the arrest of Ivo Sanader and when Croatia formally joins the EU in 2013, it has this golden moment, right? It has this golden moment where it appears like it's going to be a Central European liberal democracy. As soon as Croatia joins the EU in 2013, the first major political event in Croatia after joining the EU is what? It's a referendum on banning same-sex marriage, organized by the Catholic Church and the far-right nationalist groups in Croatia, who then summarily and successively after that, once again re-elect a series of hardline nationalist governments under the HDZ, and then a succession of increasingly volatile presidents, right? First, you have the election of, well, you have Ivo Josipović, who looks like a kind of hippie in comparison to the current president. But then you have the election of somebody like Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, whose name you might want to remember because there's a good chance that she might be the next General Secretary of NATO, who has warm penchants for far-right and neo-fascist groups, incidentally. You then get the election of Zoran Milanović, who is the current president of Croatia, who makes a habit of denying the genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who by even the fairly right-wing, even far-right Prime Minister of Croatia, Andrej Plenković, is frequently accused of being a Kremlin proxy, engages in all kinds of vulgarities, sort of, I would call him a kind of diet Trump. It's a less budget version, but there it is. Or like, Orban 2.0, right? Things aren't great in Croatia either. And at this point also, Croatia, it should be said, has no foreign policy outside of meddling in Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? This is literally the entirety of the Republic of Croatia's foreign policy. So everything that the sort of period up until 2013 was premised on in terms of the EU enlargement process, that these countries are going to democratize, they're going to liberalize, which is a term that's often forgotten. As soon as Croatia joins, that's out the window. And as the Prime Minister of Croatia today will tell you, there is virtually no daylight between Croatia's contemporary foreign policy and the foreign policy of the wartime president of the country, Franjo Tuđman. And he's very proud of that fact. And so he talks about it frequently at HDC summits. So things go very, very badly in the region. Now, already I think by the time of the first invasion of Ukraine in 2013, 2014, it's very, very clear that a new day has dawned in Europe. And it's a very dark day, and it's a very ominous day. Most regional elites respond to the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the illegal annexation of Crimea by concluding that this is essentially the twilight of the West. This is their interpretation. Because they look at what the EU does, they look at what the US does, and they say, well, they didn't do anything. Sanctions are a slap on the wrist. Most European countries continue to do business with Russia. The US is momentarily pretty upset, but pretty much shortly thereafter, it continues to be business as usual. Thereafter, then you have a series of cataclysmic events in the political West, Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, and all of the controversies that come along with that. And so if you're sitting in Belgrade and you're Aleksandar Vučić, or you're sitting, well, as he was sitting briefly at the time, Nikola Gruevski in Skopje, or you're Milorad Dodik in Banja Luka, or you're somebody like even Andrej Plenković in Zagreb, this is good. This is good. These are opportunities. This is a major categorical geopolitical realignment. And all that hokum about human rights and rule of law and all of that jazz that you've been told for the better part of the previous 15 years, that's all out the window. Oh, these are all purely transactional figures now. Oh, okay, we know how to deal with transactional figures. This is what we do here. Unsurprisingly, this is the period in which, for instance, we first formally get the floating of the so-called land swap deal between Serbia and Kosovo, or more accurately, between the then president of Kosovo, Hashim Tači, and the still president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, where their grand solution for resolving the Serbia-Kosovo deal is that they're going to swap territories. What are we going to do with the people on those territories? As one New York Times op-ed by a former Obama White House official put it, it would be an act of, and I quote, peaceful ethnic cleansing. Peaceful ethnic cleansing in the New York Times by a former Obama White House official. So, what has happened to this region? I'll repeat something that I told Vesko students earlier in the day, because we could spend an inordinate amount of time talking about the myriad details and scandals and controversies and changes to electoral laws and impositions and changes of names and what is Richard Grenell up to currently. It comes down to this. Once it becomes clear that the EU project has failed, and we can debate when the EU project fails, is it 2013, is it 2009, it doesn't actually matter. It has ceased to be that what it promised to be. The question becomes, what is plan B? For this region, for the EU, but also for the United States. Because you have to remember that for the United States, the 1990s were consumed by the Balkans. I mean, there was a few other events that happened there, right? But for the better part of the 1990s, the leading foreign policy issue for the United States, oftentimes begrudgingly, because neither the Clinton administration or the first Bush administration really wanted to deal with it, was the wars in the former Yugoslavia. First and foremost, the war in Bosnia, and then the war in Kosovo, as well as the wars in Croatia, and then later the brief insurgency in what is now North Macedonia, right? And of course, everyone forgets the very brief 10-day war in Slovenia, right? A full decade of war. This was the major issue. And so from that point on, for the United States, the EU offered something very, very specific. The EU offered not so much a normative ideological project. The EU offered, for the United States, an ability for America to disassociate, because the US had strategic interests elsewhere. First, the Middle East after 9/11, and then increasingly, especially as sort of clarified and crystallized by the Obama administration, strategic competition in the Asia-Pacific region, the rise of China. That was what the United States actually cared about. It didn't care about the Western Balkans. The problem is our friends in the European Union didn't hold up their end of the bargain. They didn't deliver on the European project. And in the interim, the project failed so badly that suddenly, in the Balkans, we had to deal with Russia and China and Turkey and Hungary and on some days even Azerbaijan. So from both the normative standpoint and the strategic standpoint, the project failed. And so now the question is again, what is plan B? And the spoiler here is there is no plan B. We don't have a plan B. The EU doesn't have a plan B. The US doesn't have a plan B. And the best way that you can illustrate this is by the increasingly growing bifurcation between EU rhetoric and projects vis-a-vis the Western Balkans and American projects vis-a-vis the Western Balkans. I'll give you one final example of this and we'll stop here and then we can kind of toss it to the group because I don't want to occupy too much time. One basic concept after everyone sort of made their peace with the idea that these countries were not going to join the European Union was, okay, can we develop some kind of interim mechanism, in part inspired by our friend Emmanuel Macron, who was like, nah, I'm good. Right? So what's the interim step between you're out in the wilderness where you're going to be eaten by Russia, or you're a full member, which you're not going to be because you're Balkan savages, so forget about that. So what's the in-betweeny? What's the in-betweeny? And the in-betweeny becomes this idea of a so-called common market. Right? That these regions are going to first create a common market among themselves, and then once they have that common market, you're going to kind of append it to the rest of the European Union. Here's the problem. In the interim, countries like Serbia, countries like Croatia, to a lesser extent countries like Albania, have started to grow into their role of being kind of regional powers. They like this idea of Western influence disappearing and fragmenting. Aleksandar Vučić really likes this idea of being a kind of latter-day Tito. He's a little bit west, he's a little bit east. All right? He likes the idea that when he turns on his Twitter account, and believe you me, he turns on his Twitter account, he sees the American ambassador to Sarajevo and the American ambassador to Belgrade posting pictures on the official US Embassy Twitter accounts of those respective two countries with Aleksandar Vučić, meeting with him in Belgrade and saying, we're here in Belgrade to discuss Bosnian sovereignty. What? Why is the American ambassador to Belgrade and the American ambassador to Sarajevo discussing with Aleksandar Vučić the question of Bosnian sovereignty? I thought President Biden had made it so that we were not going to discuss anything about Ukraine without the Ukrainians at the table. But that apparently doesn't apply to Bosnia. It also apparently doesn't apply to Kosovo. It also increasingly doesn't apply to Montenegro. So this is the thing. There's no plan B. The plan B that the United States has is increasingly kind of very, very realpolitik in a very transactional from a very transactional standpoint. Aleksandar Vučić is the big guy in the block. Let's deal with him. He'll pacify the region. If we need to, we'll talk to our friends in Zagreb. And if all else fails, we'll talk to our friends in Tirana. Which means that countries like Bosnia, countries like Kosovo, and countries like Montenegro don't really have international sovereignty or subjecthood. They are appendages and provinces of regional powers. Serbia, in other words, is what Daniel Server, a very well-known American political scientist, former diplomat, one of the leading experts on the region, right? He refers to this notion that the US treats Serbia as a pivotal state in the Western Balkans. The problem is if your pivotal state doesn't share your values, right? We've tried dealing with pivotal states in the past. As Vesko pointed out earlier in the day, we've tried that with Pakistan. We've tried that with Egypt. Once upon a time, we also tried it with Russia. Ask the Ukrainians how that worked out. So this is the thing. There's no plan B, and it's not at all clear what the future is. That's my optimistic talk.
Well, thank you for portraying the Balkans. Rosy picture. So let me just remind you that it is not Kosovars and Serbs who invented peaceful ethnic cleansing. Greeks and Turks did it 100 years before that, actually not 100 years, but almost 100 years before, in 1993, you know, and more than 2 million people, more than 2 million people were peacefully resettled, just to actually create modern Greece and modern Turkey. So allow me just to address a couple of other points when it comes to European Union and the Balkans, since you provided you know, in-depth analysis from a Balkans perspective. So I would like to briefly address popular narratives in the European Union when it comes to the Balkans. First narrative relates to the growing influence of the far right in Europe. Indeed, the far right in Europe is able to shape domestic politics in a number of countries, European countries, including France that you mentioned, Greece, and a number of others, Netherlands included. And indeed, they exploit concerns of citizens of European Union members because of influx of migrants, then workers coming from Eastern Europe, new members, and so stealing their jobs and so on and so forth. You all know those narratives. But in my view, it is not about them. It's about traditional European Union member states parties. It is about traditional right-wing parties like People's Parties. It is about traditional leftist parties like Social Democrats and Socialist parties. They don't want enlargement. And they use the right wing as an excuse to shape, actually to create, to reformulate the narratives and approach towards the Balkans. They actually exploit, they are not exploited by the right wing. They exploit the rise of right wing actually to recreate, to refurbish the approach towards the Western Balkans. This is one of the points. So we have to deal with them, not with the right wing. Because right wing, anyway, in most countries, they may go up to 10%, 12%, 15%, considerable number, but it's not critical number to shape your policy. Then the second point, the very popularity, I'm not going to speak about underperformance, but just to mention that reform fatigue is a mirror image of enlargement fatigue. And those two images actually fit one another very well. So when you have reform fatigue, you have enlargement fatigue on the other side. When we didn't have enlargement fatigue in 2008, 2009, 2010, we didn't have reform fatigue in the region. So therefore, these two images actually fit one another very well and support one another. But most importantly, very popular narrative in the Western Europe is when they turn to countries of the Western Balkans, including new members that you mentioned, they often pick out those who actually are having problems. They never turn to Baltic states. They never pick out example of Estonia, or Latvia, or Lithuania, or a couple of others who actually benefited and who contributed. And at the end of the day, we can speak about Czech Republic, and so on and so forth. So no matter you know, they never pick out those to actually use as a strong argument why enlargement matters. They pick out Romania, Bulgaria, now Hungary. I remember a long time ago when I was ambassador and I visited Netherlands to speak with Dutch MPs, and when one of them stood up and telling me, you know, we don't need another Hungary in your opinion, turning to speaking about Montenegro. Do we need more Hungary in the European Union? We have one Hungary and we have headache with that. We don't need Montenegro, Serbia, and others. You know, more of you, more headaches. And I said, fair enough. At least what I appreciate Dutch people because they tell you what they really think. While some people in our neighborhood, you know, they will clap you on the shoulder and tell you all good stories. Once you leave the room, you know, then they will change the narrative. I will stop here. I will turn out to you. We still have half an hour, and then opportunities to pose questions. Please introduce yourself, and then I see gentlemen sitting here, and then a lady over there. Let me first begin with you, and then I will turn to you. Please. No, this one with glasses, please.
Myself?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself and that.
Yes, so my name is Kristina Angelevska. I'm a Fulbright scholar here from Macedonia, or North Macedonia. My home country has been a center of attention tonight. So yes, I'm a Fulbright scholar at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, Department of Conflict Resolution. So I have a couple of comments and have a couple of questions. I'm really glad that you organized this event. You mentioned my home country, and I would say that this last political conflict and issue that my home country has experienced with Bulgaria, it was, I wouldn't say a dispute, but definitely conflict escalation in the sense of regional conflict, but also political conflict based on identities. We have had a challenging conflict with Greece for many years based on history, but this one based on the language really did not only infuriated the community in Macedonia, but also very much infuriated some key entities in the society, including the civil society, the media, and other really key actors in the community that were very much aspiring for years to move the country forward towards the process of Europeanization. That's how we say it in the Western Balkans. What is the process of Europeanization? How should we Europeanize the society in the whole of the Western Balkans, I would say, not just Macedonia. My question here would be, I'm just curious about your thoughts in terms of the third-party intervener, France, which kind of very much reminded me, France's intervention into the negotiation talks very much reminded me of the 1979 Lancaster house talks that took place in London to tackle the civil war in Zimbabwe, which very much, I would say, pushed Macedonia towards a corner of really having to adjust to the demands of the European Union. My question would be, was that the best BATNA of Macedonia? When I say BATNA, I mean best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or was the worst BATNA the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, taking into consideration the issues that come after? When I say issues, I refer to inflicted stereotypes, prejudices, and microaggressions in the society about the whole of the region. So that's a basic layer of hate speech and hate crime that arises between Macedonia, Greece, Bulgaria, and the whole of the Western Balkans region. So I'm very curious about your thoughts in regards to that.
I'll say a few things and then you can. So, let's see, the way that I agree with your premise, but it's even, I think, hard for me to talk about Macedonia having a conflict with Greece or conflict with Bulgaria. Macedonia didn't do anything. They're just like hanging out, minding their own business. And then Greece comes and says, well, you cannot be Macedonia because we have a copyright on Macedonia, basing this on 2,000 years, when actually today's Greeks have nothing to do with those Greeks. They're mostly kind of Turk adjacent. And so this construction of nationalism that we just let pass in the Greek case and many others is not, it's not a conflict. It's an opportunity to bully somebody and with a kind of nationalistic hammer. And that was allowed because Greece was already within the EU, and the same with Bulgaria. It's not Macedonia doesn't have a conflict with Bulgaria. Macedonia has a problem that Bulgaria says that Macedonians don't exist, and the Macedonian language doesn't exist, and that's how. And it's a denying of. And again, like all of identities are constructed and language is constructed, and Macedonian and Bulgarian languages are similar, and they are hybridized languages over hundreds of years of some kind of South Slav migration. Yes, we all know this, but the idea that there should be policing of other people's identity and other people's linguistic practice so that you show your own national supremacy is really kind of shocking that like to read this out loud and that's something that from within the EU passes as a reasonable policy paper. And then I said I'm going to be short, but I'm getting agitated. But the thing that I think is very dangerous, and I think you alluded to that as well, this kind of stuff produces then Macedonian nationalism because it puts different groups within the society all to the right because, it doesn't allow for any more critical views of Macedonians against their own nationalistic policies and things like Skopje 2014 craze and all the crazy stuff that the Macedonian government did. But these external nationalistic pressures then unite the population and push those groups towards right-wing nationalism and kind of conservative policies themselves, and really blankets and destroys any possibility of critical civil society response. So it's bad on all counts.
So yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with everything that Jelena said. One very particular important term that she used just now that I would highlight, especially for all the grad students in the room, looking to develop future MA theses, this notion of the EU is becoming a policing force, both in a political and I would even say in a kind of human rights standpoint. Because for those of you, for instance, that have been following what's happening along the Serbia-Bosnia border and the Croatia-Bosnia border, and the way in which ULEX basically sponsors abuses against migrants by both the Serbian and Croatian governments, that's one manifestation. But then also this notion of like policing identity, which we can see not only vis-a-vis the way that Greece has treated Macedonia and the way that Bulgaria has treated Macedonia, but we increasingly see in the way that Croatia treats Bosnia. Right? This is very, very dangerous. And also, it has to be said, whatever you want to say about the Balkan states, as Vesko was saying earlier, whatever you want to say about all of our problems, I remind you, Cyprus is an EU state. Thank you. Whatever you want to say about Kosovo, about Bosnia, Cyprus. I mean, I'm literally not going to expand on that point. Cyprus. What's that? Malta. Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, also Malta, where it's a rough neighborhood to be a journalist. So this is the thing. This idea that the EU is this like normative powerhouse, this ideological center that from on high can dictate terms to the Western Balkans and be like, well, this is how you should behave. And then you turn to Bulgaria, and then you turn to Greece, and then you turn to Cyprus, and then you turn to Croatia. Let's be serious. I think the other part for me that I feel very passionate about, and Jelena already alluded to it, is that I think on a really, I would say, basic human level, it is fundamentally unconscionable to me what Bulgaria and Greece have been allowed to do. I mean, I have yet to meet, with all due apologies to any like hardcore Greek nationalists in the room, I've yet to meet what I would characterize as an honest broker and a rational observer who has been like, you know what, Greece has a point.
Oh, it's embarrassing.
It's unconscionable to me that this was allowed to become an issue for the better part of 3 decades, and that at the end of the day, North Macedonia had to pay the price. And I'll say that also, just in case you feel like I'm preaching up from a high horse. I was very pro colorful revolution. I was very pro the then new government under the SDSM. At the time, I was in favor of a deal, and I was in favor of Prespa, because I felt it was imperative for North Macedonia to get into NATO. Now, at the same time, I'm not Macedonian. And I'm cognizant of that. And my Macedonian friends and colleagues who, after the fact, have said to me, you were wrong, I take that seriously. And I take that seriously, and I'll tell you exactly why I take that seriously. Because now, when I look at contemporary US and EU policy towards Bosnia and Kosovo, I think to myself, they may have had a point. I may not necessarily, and I certainly don't have any sympathies for the Vmro or Gruevski, but some aspect of the reservation about what Macedonia was being asked to do at the time vis-a-vis Prespa, I think it behooves all of us in the region to think much more soberly about. I think it's ultimately still a very, very good thing that North Macedonia got into NATO. I think that was a historic accomplishment. But I'm not so high on my own supply that I don't want to revisit some of the things that maybe I thought at the time in, say, 2016 or 2015. And when I look at contemporary US and EU policy towards Kosovo and Bosnia, it worries me. It very much worries me.
You mentioned Cyprus. I will add one more thing. One of the prerequisites for countries to join European Union is to have clearly defined territory, and let me quote Davutoglu, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey, 0 problems with neighbors. which means definitely Cyprus meets both criteria to join European Union. And it speaks how joining European Union is actually not political process, but merit-based process. You see, because let's judge by deeds, not by words. So, gentlemen, in the first, yes, please.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Tarek. It's good to be back here as a way of introduction. I am a two-time alum, so it's really good. I actually came back. I was 2003 and then 2008 to do a PhD. I'm also Bosnian, so I want to thank the speakers too for the great context. As a Bosnian, and not in this area but following closely, all the context aside, Bosnia is very simple and very constant, and the problem in Bosnia really is internal, and it has to do with the establishment of ethnic territories, in particular Republic of the Serbs, based on genocide, and the enshrining of that in a constitution, which is an apartheid constitution. From that standpoint, we don't necessarily need integration. We don't need acceptance. We need to do the reforms that would, lead to that potentially. We need to get rid of the Republic of the Serbs. We need to get rid of the apartheid. I guess in the way of a question, another little piece of context. The European Union and the West are actually involved in Bosnia in a way that is unprecedented, right? We have this High Representative, which is the only institution within Bosnia that is keeping Bosnia together and functioning at all. High Representatives have, stopped or put in a law that would disallow the referendum for independence. So they have prevented dissolution. They have preserved my own citizenship, because I would have lost it as a Bosnian living in the United States 10 years ago. They have stopped put in a law that stopped the denial of genocide. And this this last High Representative had allowed us to have an election, because the previous government there was a constitutional crisis. The Constitutional Court had some technical issue, and the election was not necessarily going to be funded and was not necessarily going to be held. Right now, Bosnia is still in danger of being dissolved. The Republic of the Serbs is still trying to be independent, and as a way of becoming independent, they are actually attacking the legitimacy and of the Office of High Representative. And so my question is in particular to Mr. Mujanović, is why do now also Bosnians who are not supporting Dodik and Republika Srpska also attacking the current High Representative and the Office of the High Representative, which is extremely damaging to the country, and in a way that, having analyzed all of the decisions, seems really baseless to me.
Thank you for the question. So I think the short answer is that your interpretation of what I think in particular the current High Representative Christian Schmidt has done, both vis-a-vis the quote-unquote reform, or rather more accurately changes to the electoral law and the constitution of the federation entity, it's certainly not without controversy or without opposition this idea that he has in any sense improved the governance of the federation. I'll remind you that obviously the election law changes and the amendment of the Constitution occurred 15 minutes after the polls had closed on Election Day in October 2022, which was very controversial and unprecedented, the idea that you would change an electoral law as votes were being counted. Also, moreover, the grounds on which the electoral law was changed and the constitution was changed, as was then advertised or claimed by Christian Schmidt, as well as the US Embassy in Sarajevo and the UK Embassy, who were the only people supporting it, was that he had unblocked government formation in the Federation entity. We are now 200 plus days after October 2nd. Obviously, there's no government. We still have the same government in place that was originally seated in 2015. I think most civil society activists in Bosnia and Herzegovina have come to the conclusion, myself included, that Christian Schmidt's amendments to the Constitution and the electoral law have deepened the sectarian and segregationist character of the constitutional and legal order in the country. Certainly, they've done nothing to move the country closer to the standards of the famed EU, or more accurately, to move it closer to the realization of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, Sejdić, Finci, Zornić, Pilav, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, I think, there's just a fundamental disagreement in terms of how people interpret what Christian Schmidt has done. And obviously, as early as this week, we're expecting that he will have to amend his own amendments, because obviously what he did on October 2nd has not produced the desired outcome. We can debate as to why that may be. I have my own interpretation, you have your own interpretation. But then also there is the fact that when we are talking about, you've brought up the Republika Srpska entity several times, the high representative, not just this high representative, but previous high representatives have these bond powers, which allow them to sack publicly elected officials. And as you pointed out, Bosnia and Herzegovina now officially has an anti-genocide denial law, which Mr. Dodik routinely violates. The United States has openly stated, the State Department and the Treasury Department have openly stated that Milorad Dodik receives funds from Russia. He's under US sanctions. He's under UK sanctions. Large segments of his political party are under UK and US sanctions. Why has he not been removed from office? Right? This is a very simple question. Why is the United States supporting the creation of yet another ethnic territory in the north of Kosovo, the so-called Association of Serbian Municipalities, while simultaneously saying to the Kosovo Republic in op-eds published by members of the State Department, Derek Chalet and Gabriel Escobar, addressed to the actual Kosovo Republic, saying, rest assured, this will not be another Republika Srpska. Why is that being said to the Kosovo public, but the Bosnian public is being told, never mind, that RS is fine? Again, the United States wrote the Bosnian Constitution. Yes, of course it did.
Signed by Bosnia.
Who wrote it?
Bosnians negotiated it.
Who wrote it?
Negotiated. Americans just were the professional
Just a mediator.
service.
Okay.
There is no grand American conspiracy against Bosnia.
I didn't say conspiracy. I said it's literally an American Constitution.
I would like that, since somebody mentioned Bosnia, so then I will also ask you to read a little bit more what the role of mediator is and how much mediator is involved in negotiation. Mediator actively participates in negotiation, even putting forward proposals for sides which are involved in negotiation. But we have two more people who wanted to. I see you. Yeah, you wanted to. Then I see a gentleman over there. Let me see how many of you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can take 5 of you if you have brief questions and then brief answers. Please.
Or if you want to meet us in the parking lot.
I don't know if my question.
Yeah, please.
I don't know if my question is brief. I hope it is. There are a couple of things that you mentioned. Thank you, you've been extremely clear on everything else. But when you were talking about pacifistic, or whatever the word you use, cleansing.
Peaceful ethnic cleansing.
Yeah. Would you, just to understand your definition of it, and I assume you brought it up because you agree with it?
No, not at all.
You agree with the statement that it is a cleansing?
Oh yes, I agree, it's ethnic cleansing.
So I'm just curious, would you consider the division of Pakistan and Bangladesh from India as a pacifistic cleansing as well? And the second question I have for you, you mentioned that, I forgot his name, might become a head of NATO, and yet you also mentioned that he is a puppet of Kremlin.
It's two different people.
Yeah. But I'm just wondering, isn't it a little bit of a contradiction that a puppet of Kremlin would have any kind of possibility, never mind a probability, to becoming a head of NATO?
Well, so a couple things, and I'll be very quick. One, it's two different people, and I apologize if I confuse people. So the current president of Croatia, Zoran Milanović, is the person who is widely seen as being very close to the Kremlin, rhetorically or otherwise, including accused by the Prime Minister of Croatia, Andrej Plenković. The person who is likely, or at least is a very serious candidate to be the next General Secretary of NATO, is the previous president of Croatia, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, who also has some slightly uncomfortable links with Vladimir Putin, but is mostly, I think, should be disqualified on the grounds of her own far-right links among Croatian nationalists. Although she also has some very dodgy pictures with Putin, but we don't need to go into that. As for the question of vis-a-vis Bangladesh and Pakistan, and I guess we could also potentially even include, India and Pakistan. That question, yes. I mean, look, I'm somebody who's very critical of partition. I think partition is sort of the last defense of the scoundrel, as it were. I think, unfortunately, Western governments, very unfortunately, even though most Western states today are very multi-ethnic societies, when Western governments tend to look at the world, they really like neat solutions. And there's oftentimes no neater solution in their imaginations than this idea of draw a line in the sand. That, of course, never works out. And as Vesko said, we have the population exchanges between Turkey and Greece. We obviously have, the partition, the de facto partition of Cyprus. We have Northern Ireland. We have Kosovo. We have Bosnia, and on down the list. So I generally favor the creation of multi-ethnic societies, multi-ethnic democracies, multi-ethnic polities, multi-ethnic federations, however you want to put it. I'll defer to my colleagues who work on South Asian politics as to the details of the Bangladesh-Pakistan conflict, but certainly Pakistan committed tremendous atrocities against the people of Bangladesh during that period, hence the independence of the country in any case.
We have a gentleman over there. Be brief, yeah, please.
I'll try my absolute best. Thank you so much for such an interesting, refreshing, and really frank talk. I have two questions. You can sort of answer them in one. To both panelists. The first, I'm sort of thinking about French and EU identitarianism and, this sort of link with pan-European ontological security, and I'm sort of thinking about threats to that sort of ontology and what sort of role does sort of changing narratives in the EU and the West play with that certain, as Mitzen puts it, desire to experience oneself as a whole. Sounds like a very big sort of question, but I think the more granular question here is also tied to this ontology of enlargement in the EU, and that sort of implicit conflation, of course, for the EU being a little democratic project, which we know, of course, isn't exactly really what it is. And I'm also thinking, too, about that sort of Fukuyama's sort of inevitability thesis. And would you sort of agree with that assessment of the EU sort of having a certain ontology of enlargement sort of tied to that sort of inevitability thesis, and the sort of role of those narratives then versus now, and what we've sort of seen happen with those sort of changes, in the UK and also in the US as well, and how that utility has faded as a function of time.
I want to answer this. I'm so happy. I did not apply to this event thinking I'll get a chance to talk about ontological security. I'm so happy right now. I can't even. So yes, to all of this, yes, I do think that the EU has an issue of ontological security to normal people in the room. That just means security of your own identity. That's really what we're talking about. And so yes, and that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier, that I think for the purposes of EU's own sense of self, it needs to push this constant, in ontological security terms, routines and practices of, yes, we'll have a meeting, yes, we'll meet with them, yes, we'll promise enlargement, and so we just keep on going, and it gives a certain stability through time, even though there's no results. And you mentioned Jennifer Mitzen. She's writing a book on unthinkability, which is where she's taking this whole idea, which is when something's become unthinkable. So in the context of the EU, it's unthinkable to say out loud there will be no more enlargement. It's unthinkable to say we'll kick countries out. But that unthinkability of certain policy choices brings problems, because then you kind of circumscribe your own options, and you kind of put yourself in a straitjacket. But it's an important psychological mechanism to continue a certain stability and your own sense of who you are. I mean, what's the EU if it's not going around promising that everybody's become liberal democracy? It's just a bank in Frankfurt. But thank you, I'm so happy.
We have 2 more questions. I will pick up 2 more questions and then turn to you, and this will conclude our discussion for this evening because we are running out of time. You know, Kaya, first you, and then I know Theo, and who is the and Vlado. Okay, sorry, Vlado.
Okay, gotta have Vlado. I haven't seen Vlado in 3
Okay,
years.
please.
Okay.
So I'm going to follow up on Brendan's question and just push a little harder because I study the EU, and I study the EU as a state formation project. That's how I study it, in the ways in which it's like a state. And I know it's not a state, but its processes are very recognizable to me as a state, including the control of violence. So I study a lot of security functions, including the violence at the border of Europe and the creation of tools of violence. And so it's very state-like. And it's also like a developing state to me because it is very influenced by lobbyists and for-profit actors in the way that it is very open to capture. And so that's how I study it. So I could title an entire book, People Who've Yelled at Me in Brussels, who are very angry about that, right? But I would go even further, and I kind of pose in the hypothesis, 2-part question, but very fast, I'm trying to talk fast, is that in my mind, I blame the EU for all of this, even though you have regional, post-crises, political trajectory of increasing disappointment trajectories over time. But I think that part of this is baked into the EU. I would tell a hypothesis that there was a big bang of enlargement that was useful to the EU at a moment in time. There was also a little bit of a hat trick pulled by the Commission to try to manipulate member states and everything. And that was a one-off kind of phenomenon, a cluster of phenomenon. And that other than that, it's not just a narrative and a procedure that makes enlargement useful to the EU. It's a fairy tale of identity. That it is a large charity that can just expand through the whole world, and then it can't be a state-like entity. But the failures of enlargement are beyond just the Balkans. I mean, the EU's go through iterations of processes like a neighborhood policy or a Mediterranean Union.
But Turkey's still on the list.
Exactly.
Everybody here don't think that Turkey's going to get into the EU anytime soon.
So I just want to pose, I could go on, but I just want to pose 2 hypotheses. One is that the failure is baked in from the EU side all along, or it would have been possible except there were failures along the way. Kind of going back to your original frame.
Well, that's kind of what I was saying.
Yeah.
Yes, I think the setup was not going to be successful because it's a fantasy, or because I call it an idea slightly more politely, but fantasy is more brutal. I can see why people yell at you in Brussels.
I wish I was there, yeah. It's just not, institutionally and kind of system-wise structured in a way that could organize the enlargement of this nature. I think maybe would have, counterfactual with a more kind of, enlarged market for maybe what they're trying to do now with this second tier kind of EU on the cheap, the budget coupon,
diet EU.
That you're not going to get into EU, but good luck. You can get a slightly less tariff on your goods. Maybe a more modest, but more geographically spread out process from the beginning could have been a better idea. I mean, I have no idea, but I agree with that's kind of what I was going with this.
I would just very quickly say, I think I take the latter view. I don't think it was doomed to failure, but I think there was a whole sequence of decisions that were made, as Jelena was pointing out, that doomed it in practice. I think had the process been much slower, but much more robust and normative, we would all be in much better shape. If we were having much deeper conversations about what it is that makes a democracy, and what it is that rule of law actually means, and also that the process necessarily involved self-reflection, as you put. I mean, I'll just cite what a number of MEPs told me when I was in Brussels last. We were having conversations about the Balkans and and one of them said to me, we're starting to get alarmed here in Brussels because we're actually beginning to see the signs of state capture within European institutions, as we have seen them in Hungary and Poland. incidentally, by the same actors.
There was a Transparency International corruption report about the EU that got buried 7 years ago. So.
Two more questions, and then it's Theo. Yes.
My name is Theo. I'm a student of Vesko's in the Balkans class. My question was about, so in the beginning of the lecture, you spoke about how the EU expansion dream is being lost more so because of kind of the EU collapsing in on itself with democratic backsliding, no way out for countries that the EU doesn't want in, and things like that. But however, they have made this commitment to the Western Balkans. I was wondering, do you see a future in which the European Union could effectively create these systems to hold accountability for its members once they're in, or with some consequences like expulsion perhaps, or others? And do you see a system in which sort of the EU could be held accountable at the very least for its hypocrisy in the actions of Macron and the actions of the Netherlands in essentially lying and steering along these West Balkans countries? And through this accountability, could the EU be expanded at the very least for infrastructure and for movement of people?
Jelena?
No, you go ahead. I mean, I just say, like, for old Macron, like, Macron is he's gonna get blown up on his own petard by domestic French politics, but we're all gonna miss him when Le Pen becomes the new leader. So we'll all be like, oh, Emmanuel.
The liberal boy wonder.
Yes.
I think it's very difficult for me to see how the EU gets out of its current structural crisis with Hungary and Poland without another round of constitutional reform, European constitutional reform. But at the same time, why would at least the current Polish and Hungarian governments agree to that, right? Why would they ever allow for the introduction of a clause, for instance, that would permit them to be ejected from the Union? So then we go back to what Jelena was saying. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view of it, I think the only realistic prospect for the process to be reformed in a positive sense of the term would be for domestic changes, first and foremost in Hungary and Poland. Absent that, I think, as unlikely as it may seem at this juncture, an actual meaningful structural crisis and ultimately an implosion of the European Union as we understand it today is the way forward.
Just to remind you, and before a comment from my side, I assume that you remember that when the Austrian government, the first time, Austria got like a right wing a long time ago, then the European Union imposed sanctions.
They had the
only.
freedom guys.
That was a different European
Union.
Union. Now European Union is not capable to do the same with countries which are violating European Union norms and values.
The Enlargement Commissioner for the Enlargement Commissioner, not just for the Western Balkans, the Enlargement Commissioner is from where? Hungary.
Yeah, that's another story. Yeah. Vlado, you are the last one, please.
Thank you so much, and really thank you for your presentations. Food for thoughts, not happy thoughts though.
We're Boston.
Yeah, my question is actually about this bank in Frankfurt.
Do you know?
So, where is it actually? No, seriously, it seems to me that this is always an underestimated element in this story. The other day, my good colleague from University of Sarajevo, Damir Kapidzic, completely surprised me when he calculated the GDP of all of those countries we talk about, all the five, is somewhere around Slovakia. And then he said, yes, why would you give so much decision-making votes and powers to five mutually hostile entities whose GDP is somewhere around Slovakia? So I'm just trying to look at it from that perspective. That probably in the EU there are people who are completely happy with having like periphery of the periphery, which is what the Balkans are at this point. On the other hand, the people who are ruling those five countries are like, well, I mean, this is apparently not the land of milk and honey. They want us to get in and then to support democratization of some other place, whatever. No. We are much more happier as it was before. For some reason, the EU gives us lots of money for some structural reforms that we then subvert. So that basically both sides are pretending to dance some tango, whereby both sides are totally happy, and one thing goes through the window, which is any sort of meaningful human rights standard. And my question is, if such is the case, then what's the appeal of Europeanization process in any way? Because if the EU standard goes through the door, then really, I don't know why would one think of it as a serious way to go for these communities and societies.
What is that old Soviet joke? We pretend to work, they pretend to pay us. Yeah. So they pretend to expect reforms, we pretend to enact them. Yeah. That's the same version. I think the question, or rather, pardon me, the answer to your question is that the appeal of the EU remains normative for ordinary citizens. When you talk to the John Q. public in Skopje, in Belgrade, in Sarajevo, Tuzla, Zenica, whatever, and you ask them, what is it that you think of when somebody says the EU? You think Austria, Germany, Frankfurt, Munich. I think good schools, good public health care, my children have a future. I go to a park, there's a thing where the dogs poop and there's a fence, and my God, it's modernity. Right? That's what they think of the EU. When the reality of what the European enlargement process entails comes to the fore of, here comes the enlargement commissioner from Hungary, who is going to have a party with Milorad Dodik in a gas station restaurant. That's not what anyone had in mind. And I think I always take the view that I am categorically committed to the European project as an ideological project. I am categorically opposed to the actually existing EU because I consider it a fundamental betrayal of virtually every liberal and democratic normative value. And again, whatever you want to say from a kind of Brussels perspective about what the EU is and what the EU should preach to Kosovo or Bosnia or Serbia or Montenegro, Cyprus, Hungary. I don't think Hungary or Cyprus have anything to say to Bosnia or Kosovo or Serbia. And it's a joke. Right? And I think that ultimately, to the point I think that was raised here earlier, that at the end of the day, whatever you want to say about the Balkans, is the fault of the EU. And that, that goes down to individual policy. A Hungarian Orban official had to be a member of the Commission, but he didn't have to be in the enlargement commissioner, did he? Right? You could have given him something else, but you made him an enlargement commissioner. And now you want to talk about norms and values.
Jelena, anything to add?
Well, I think like most societies, I think societies in the Western Balkans are probably polarized, and you're probably going to get people for whom the EU still represents a desirable fantasy and still represents a future to which they want to belong. And it probably means, like park with dog poop bags. It's an image that really is going to sit with me. But I think for some people it does represent ability to travel and ability to live outside of your small little, increasingly kind of xenophobic, small-mindedness, parochialism, ability to travel, ability maybe that your children can work someplace else. I think, when people from Serbia travel to Croatia for vacations, I think they see it's a little bit better. The roads are a little bit better and the hotels are a little bit better. It's incrementally better than Serbia is. I think they will not admit that and complain, but I think they know that. So I think for some people, there's still a fantasy that if we were to get into the EU, it will be better. But I think for many others, that is just not the case. And their identity is not wrapped up in these fantasies of Western European future. It's much more wrapped up in the fantasies of continuing victimization and trying to find kind of who is the person, who is the country, who is the great power, who screwed them. And I think that's why they are much more likely to be allied with Russia. And they're finding an enemy in the EU that justifies their kind of relatively miserable standard of living, and it's easier to find that. So I think those societies are quite polarized, but they're polarized within the EU themselves. In Croatia, opinion polls have consistently shown that not everybody thinks this was such a good idea. Things have gotten much more expensive. It's very difficult to buy property or an apartment. Salaries have not caught up. It's economic crisis like everywhere else. And I think some of the massive hopes that a lot of Croatian citizens had about joining to the EU maybe have not, turned out as a fairy tale that they thought themselves would be. But I would think And I think in a place like Bosnia, and you'll know much better than I do, the Bosnian domestic context, I do think that for a considerable amount of people in Bosnia, the EU is the place that you join, and that guarantees peace. That it's very difficult to imagine peace or continuing security without actually being in the EU. The EU is the collective security that prevents your country from falling apart. So even without the economic aspect, I think the provision of security for a place like Bosnia or Kosovo it continues to be important.
Okay, on that good note, thank you so much. Thank you for your interest in the topic, interesting questions. From my side, I can tell you one thing. No matter how critical you are about European Union, I will continue wearing this tie. Because hope dies, Yeah. Okay. See you then on another event.